Good evening, everyone. I'm Swa, and I'm working as an associate security consultant at Secure 7. Also, I am Nal Ahmedabad chapter leader, and my spare time I do play CTA. So I welcome you all to the today's webinar for cyber threat evaluation. So the agenda for today's talk is what is the cyber threat intelligence? How can we analyze it? How to approach to a cyber threat? Components of a cyber threat analysis process, best practices, some real facts. So let's get started. So ever got a question, what is cyber threat intelligence? Let me simplify for you. What is cyber threat intelligence is what cyber threat information becomes once it has been collected, evaluated in the context of its source and reliability, and analyzed through rigorous and structured tradecraft techniques by those with substantive expertise and access to all source information. Like all cyber threat intelligence provides a value add to cyber threat information, which reduces uncertainty for the consumer while aiding the consumer in identifying threats and opportunities. It requires that analysts identify similarities and differences in vast quantities of information and detect deceptions to produce accurate, timely, and relevant intelligence. So why are we vulnerable to it? In today's growing digital world, each and everyone should be aware about the term cyber threat. The use of technology has emerged with a drastic speed which was not expected by any one of us. Ever got a question? How safe is my social profile? How safe is the information which I publish over the social media? Am I giving my confidential details to a reliable source? If yes, then you have thought about cyber threat, or else you don't consider your information to be confidential. Now, let's move on to the next slide about the process. How can we analyze it, the cyber threat, and what are the processes of it? So, how can we analyze it? There are several methodologies by the organizations which can be used to perform cyber threat analysis, but each at a core level shares the following key components or the phases. First phase is known as scope. The second is data collection. Afterwards come the threat analysis, and the next is mitigation and acceptance. So you all may be aware about some of the terminologies, but now let's deep dive into it. So what is scope? The first step in any cyber threat analysis should be to identify every suspectable item that must be protected from access by malicious third parties. After this, the level of sensitivity and desired degree of protection of the item is drafted and extensively defined by the analysis drafters. So the scope of a cyber threat analysis states what will be included and excluded from the analysis. Included items are those items that should be protected from the threat. So now let's move on to the next phase, which is data collection. So what is data collection? In every well-structured organization, there are procedures and policies to guide how people, machines, and other components of an organization are expected to operate. All this need to be clearly stated out for compliance purposes. The method to collect from reliable or unreliable sources of information could be intrusion incidents, detection system logs, reported exploitations, firewall logs, and reverse engineering, and much more. In the collection of data usage, the first step is to collect information about the actual cyber attack or threat incidents. Example could be phishing email header and content, uncovered hostile command and control infrastructure of the IP address and domain names, URLs to the malicious links, and so on. One must distinguish between real potential attacks and threats that are not real but are perceived threats. The scope should help filter out perceived threats in order to ensure that the focus is on targeted threats that exist in reality. Now let's move on to the next phase, which is threat analysis. The system assets, and enterprise. Security tools are tested and evaluated against the information gathered to determine where potential threats could be. For each threat identified, the organization will also determine the probability that the threat will be realized, as well as potential impacts if the threat is exploited. Also, the analyst test what has already been gathered in order to determine the extent of current exposure. The existing security defense is tested to determine whether it has the capability to neutralize the information threats in terms of integrity, availability, and confidentiality. This stage could be double check whether the current policies, security measures are adequate protective measures. Hope you got the fair understanding of the phase. Now let's move on to another phase, which is mitigation and acceptance. So the organization must then determine which vulnerabilities will be mitigated and which will be accepted. This acceptance can be due to the cost of difficulty, or to the low probability of the occurrence, or even its potential to disrupt business services if altered. After completion of all other previous steps, a highly qualified analyst can then use the information of threat data identified to determine the preventive measures. The analyst has the task to categorize the threat data into groups, allocate each pattern to specific threat actors, and implement mitigation measures. Subsequently, the analyst must anticipate the occurrence of similar attack in the future. Now, let's move on the next slide to learn how to approach to the cyber threats. Okay, so threat models and metrics included in this section are meant to aid in characterization of specific threats, hence fulfilling the elementary purpose of threat analysis. There are two types of approaches: threat metrics and threat models. While threat model has subcategories which are threat attributes, attack vectors, target characteristics, and attack trees. So about threat metrics, we would be going on in our next slide. Now let's get an overview about the subcategories of threat models. So what is threat attribute? It is an independent feature of a threat. Next, what is an attack vector? This is the path or route used by a threat to gain access to a system, network, or a device, primarily to launch a cyber attack, plant a malware, gather relevant information. Next, what are the target characteristics? The rate at which targets are hit by the threats vary because some are more vulnerable and attractive than others. The frequency of attack on a target is also significant information to be expressed in metrics. Next comes the attack trees. It is a concept which is structured in a way to logically collect and document the anticipated or likely attacks on a given system. The tree decomposes the threat agents depending on the type of attack which agent utilizes. So now let's know more about the threat metrics. So if a threat is perfectly measured in a consistent way with the help of a good metric, then that is clear and unambiguous as well, then the analyst is most likely to upgrade this ability to understand that threat, affect, control, and defend against it for a given period of time. Decision making as per the correct interpolation is much simpler if the nebulosity is not extremely dark. An ideal example of an appropriate quantitative portal is cyberspace is the number of intrusions or attacks per month. When these figures are taken for a long stretch of time, then they can reveal the capability and intent of an adversary. This gives an analyst the task to properly calculate all possible risk and further allocate resources required to sort. So understanding how anomalies and trends occur can be used to facilitate the threat analysis process when an accurate measurement of event is done. It can also underline the ability of certain types of threats. This is done by joining the missing dots between the experienced threats and the possible consequences. In short, qualitative threat measurement techniques and process should give give precise results concerning risk management, and metric can be defined as a unit of measure. So now let's know more about the threat modeling process. So before going on the modeling process, let us know about what is threat. A threat model is basically a well-organized representation of all the necessary information that affects the security of a system, application, or network server. This can be simply termed as the view of an organization technology via security glass, capturing, organizing, and analyzing all gathered information in an understandable and logical order is known as threat modeling. So now let's start to know about the threat modeling process. So starting with the first, identify the assets. Point out each and every asset that must be protected. Second, come up with architectural overview. Use tables and relatively simple designs to document the architecture of your system. Other components to be include trust boundaries, data flow, and subsystems. So next is to identify the risk. Having the attacker's goal in mind as well as known how on the architecture and potential vulnerabilities of your system. Identify the risk that could definitely affect the system or the application. Logically document. So the next step comes the logically document the threats in an organized manner. Use a common threat template to capture the attributes specific to each and every threat. The next step is rate the threat. Arrange the threats in an order of the potential damage that they are capable of causing to the system, such that the most significant threats come first. And the last is break down the application. Break down the architecture of your application, including the underlying host infrastructure design, so as to come up with a security profile for the system. So hope you have got a basic overview about the threat modeling processes, and it would definitely help you in modeling a good model about the product or the asset in the company. So now let's know about some of the best practices which we need to follow. So now starting with the first, timing is critical. Threat assessment may not be well suited to all phases of acquisition program. For example, the threat matrix cannot be constructed without knowledge of cyber assets that make up the system. The identification of cyber assets is derived from the system's allocated baseline. So the next step is assume the adversary can gain access. Assume. How is the best practice achieved? Mission assurance engineering is based on assumption that APT adversaries are able to successfully penetrate a system's security perimeter and gain persistent access. So next step is the importance of documented rationale as context for future efforts. It is important to record the rationale for eliminating candidate attack for consideration, including assumptions made regarding the system security posture or security technical implementation guide. So the next point is the more than one cyber risk assessment methodology. Several methodologies similar to TSA assess risk to cyber assets. Each methodology functions by accessing cyber assets using a defined set of evaluation criteria. The criteria used in this article, default score model, are representative of criteria used by other methodologies and can be tailored to meet the needs of the program. So the next steps is the pathological scores and what to do about them. Certain pathological TTP scoring modes may reflect situations where more information about a cyber asset is required. Evaluation criteria need to be revised or signed range of values is either too narrow or too wide. So the next step comes the variation on the TTP risk scoring theme. One variation on TTP risk score calculation is to compute low and high TTP risk scores based on a range of values for each evaluation criteria. This approach produces risk scoring that reflects best case and worst case assumptions. So now let's observe some real facts on the cyber threat. There's a small disclaimer. The statistical data may not be accurate, but to an extent, yes. If any queries regarding the numbers, you can visit the reference link attached about from where the information has been referred. So now let's get started with some real facts. So here we have there's an image of an annual report about the data breach in USA occurred in the year 2020. This came in a total of 1001 cases. Meanwhile, over the course of same year, over 155.8 million individuals were affected by data exposures, that is accidental revelation of sensitive information due to less than adequate information security. So this was a basic information shared by me. So the next is the top 5 data breach happened in 2020. So here are the five listed companies who suffered data breach in 2020, and Security Magazine article which have published the name of the companies and the approx data records which are exposed. So the next question always arrives: why do cyber attacks happen? So most often cyber attacks happen because criminals want your business financial data, customers financial details, example the credit card or any banking details, sensitive personal data, customers or staff email addresses and login credentials through which they could use them for the further exploitation. Next, customer databases, client list for rivalry in businesses to overcome it, IT infrastructure. Next is the IT services, example the ability to accept online payments, intellectual properties, example trade secrets or product designs. So these are the reasons why cyber attacks happen on a organization. And the next is a reference link from where all the source of information have been referred, and I would thank each and every reliable source for providing such an information. And yeah, thank you everyone for your presence. Stay safe, stay at home. Hope you have enjoyed the webinar and gained knowledge about the cyber threat intelligence.